Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Kansas. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The Baker homestead stood alone on the open prairie, some 20 miles southwest of Hays City. In 1888, the region was still wild, flat land that seemed to go on forever, dotted only by windmills and the faint silhouettes of barns. Travelers passed through these routes on their way to Dodge or Wichita, but few ever stopped unless desperate. The Bakers, however, had built a reputation for offering food and rest to those making the long journey. What little remains in the county archives suggests the Bakers were not newcomers. The property was first filed under the Homestead Act in 1873 by a man named Jonas Baker. He was later listed as deceased in 1879, leaving the estate to his widow Martha and her two sons, Elias and Samuel. Those names appear again and again in tax ledgers, probate disputes, and one census entry that lists occupation, ranchers, and keepers of wayfarers. That phrase, keepers of wayfarers, would come to mean something darker than anyone could have imagined. For years, the Bakers' farm operated quietly, producing modest crops and keeping a few cattle. But by 1888, travelers began to avoid the route entirely. A letter dated February of that year, found in the archives of the Hays Sentinel, mentions a strange odor carried on the wind near the Baker place. Another, written by a traveling preacher named Reverend Cole, describes being offered stew and coffee, but declining because the woman's stare was cold as the iron pot on her stove. Neighbors, if one could call them that, since no house stood within 5 miles, rarely saw the Bakers in town. The few who did said they were distant but polite. Martha Baker, they recalled, wore black even in summer, as though mourning someone long dead. Elias, the elder son, was thin, reserved, and never looked people in the eye. Samuel, younger, was said to be more cordial, but children avoided him, frightened by his quiet laughter. By late summer, travelers started disappearing. The first report came from a cattle driver named Thomas Grant, whose wagon was found abandoned by a dry creek. His horses were missing, but his coat and ledger remained. A few weeks later, a German immigrant family, the Webers, were last seen heading toward the Baker Road after their wagon wheel broke near Ellis. None of them reached their destination. When a search party rode out in September, they found the Baker homestead empty, chairs overturned, dishes half cleaned, a single window cracked open. The sheriff noted that the back door was secured with a crude iron latch from the outside, meaning someone had locked it after leaving. In the barn, straw covered what appeared to be newly disturbed ground. Local papers briefly covered the mystery, but offered no conclusion. To some, it was another case of settlers abandoning their claims. But one name began appearing again and again in side remarks: the Bakers. Their isolation, their strange behavior, and the missing travelers drew inevitable comparisons to the bloody Benders of Cherry Vale, another Kansas family, some 15 years earlier, who'd murdered guests at their inn and buried them beneath their property. That connection, while circumstantial, planted a seed of fear that would outlast the Bakers themselves. When lawmen first approached the abandoned Baker homestead, they found no sign of struggle inside. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and mice had chewed through the corners of a burlap sack left near the hearth. Yet something about the silence of the place felt wrong, as though the air itself carried an old secret. Sheriff Amos Leland, who led the initial inspection, later wrote in his notes, "The house was quiet, but it did not rest easy. You could feel the vacancy like a wound." Leland's men started outside, sweeping the yard with lanterns. Behind the barn they found 3 narrow trenches, newly covered with soil and packed firm. Each measured roughly the length of a man. Thinking they were animal graves, the sheriff prodded the first with his spade and struck wood. Beneath a few inches of dirt lay fragments of a wooden crate, and inside, what appeared to be a stained piece of fabric and a single human tooth. Leland ordered the area cordoned off and sent word to the county coroner. The following morning, A wagon arrived carrying Dr. Horace Keene, a physician from Hayes. He was an old man by then, with sharp eyes and a steady voice. His official report, preserved in the county archives, describes a partial skeleton of an adult male, several ribs fractured, and signs of blunt trauma to the rear of the skull. The remains were exhumed from shallow ground, and the soil bore traces of ash and grease. Keene speculated that the body had been burned partially before burial, though no fire pit was found nearby. Inside the house, more disturbing clues surfaced. On the pantry door hung a ledger, tacked to the wood with a nail. Written in slanted cursive were columns of names, mostly travelers, noted as guests. Next to several entries were strange markings, circles, crosses, and the word served. Under the lamplight, one of the deputies murmured, "What they served, I wonder." Rumors spread quickly through the nearby townships. Old-timers whispered that the Bakers had turned to cannibalism, though no evidence beyond local imagination supported that claim. Still, the stories multiplied. Someone claimed a traveling butcher had delivered unusual cuts to the Bakers weeks before their disappearance. Another insisted she'd seen Martha Baker washing something red from her hands at the creek. By October of 1888, the Baker homestead became a site of grim fascination. Locals arrived by wagon to peer through the windows, daring one another to step inside. The sheriff eventually ordered the property sealed until the investigation was complete. It was during one of these later searches that Deputy Walter Reeves found a hollow space beneath the kitchen floorboards. Inside rested a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, containing old letters, a few coins, and a small daguerreotype photograph showing a young woman seated beside two boys, presumably Martha, with Elias and Samuel. Their faces were unsmiling, eyes pale and distant, like people caught mid-thought in a long exposure. Sheriff Leland sent the box to Topeka for examination, but no clear results were ever published. What became clear, however, was that the Bakers had vanished entirely. No trace of them in neighboring towns, no purchases recorded, no sightings. One newspaper speculated that they fled north toward Nebraska. Another claimed they'd been seen boarding a freight train in Salina under false names, but the official report listed them simply as missing, presumed at large. Years later, while reviewing the case, a historian from the Kansas State Historical Society compared the Baker ledger to that of the infamous Bloody Benders. The handwriting, he noted, shared certain peculiarities, the same looping B, the same half-formed S. It was perhaps coincidence or something deeper, the echo of O, the murderous lineage fading into another. The Baker case might have faded into local obscurity had it not been for one peculiar discovery in early 1889. In January, snow had melted unevenly across the plains, revealing strange indentations in the soil near the abandoned homestead. A group of ranch hands, passing through on their way to Hayes, noticed the shapes, long, narrow patches of ground where the snow refused to settle, as if the earth beneath was still warm. They reported the sighting to Sheriff Leland, who reluctantly rode out again with his deputy. This time, the search went beyond the barn and house. A few hundred feet from the orchard, they found what appeared to be the remains of a cellar entrance. The boards were rotted through, hidden beneath weeds and fallen branches. Beneath it, the ground opened into a small earthen chamber, no taller than a man, reeking of mold and decay. Inside, Leland's lantern revealed hooks hammered into the rafters, a cracked mirror, and a row of empty jars along the wall. In one corner, a crate contained folded clothing, bits of jewelry, and scraps of paper bearing faint handwriting. Among those fragments was a page torn from a local newspaper, the Hayes Sentinel, dated June 1888, reporting the disappearance of a cattle broker named David Holt. Written in pencil across the margin were two words, "Next guest." The handwriting matched that in the ledger. Dr. Keene examined the cellar a week later and described it in his notes as a crude workshop or holding room, not a typical storage space. He identified several stains along the earthen floor as possibly human blood, though his instruments at the time could not confirm it. When questioned by journalists, Keene refused to speculate publicly, stating only that the scene bears unpleasant similarities to the Cherryvale incident of the 1870s, a clear reference to the Bloody Benders. The investigation, however, soon reached a standstill. The Kansas plains were vast, and communications slow. Without telegraph lines running directly to the county seat, warrants and inquiries took weeks to exchange. By the time word reached neighboring jurisdictions, months had passed, and any trail had long gone cold. In March 1889, a man calling himself E. Barker checked into a boarding house near Fort Scott, nearly 200 miles east. The innkeeper later told police the man was quiet, nervous in a way that made the other guests uncomfortable. He stayed 3 nights, paid in silver dollars, and left before dawn. When the marshal examined the abandoned room, he found a folded handbill advertising fresh meals and lodging at the Baker Ranch near Hayes. The handwriting on the reverse, "Tell no one," was identical to that of the ledger entries. Rumors reignited. The Topeka Daily Capital published a sensational piece under the headline, "Echoes of the Benders," quoting unnamed sources who believed the Bakers were continuing their crimes elsewhere under new names. The article compared the structure of the Baker house, its secret cellar and false wall, to those described in the old Bender homestead, which had become folklore by then. Sheriff Leland publicly dismissed these claims as reckless storytelling. Yet privately, his own correspondence reveals growing unease. In one surviving letter to the state marshal, he wrote, "I fear we are dealing not with simple murderers, but with people who have learned to vanish as easily as they kill." By summer, the Baker homestead was stripped bare. Vandals pried loose boards, scavengers took furniture, and souvenir hunters pocketed fragments of the ledger. The house itself began to sag, windows shattered by storms. Locals said the soil never quite settled where the graves had been dug, and that cattle refused to graze there. A teacher passing through the area in 1891 noted in her journal, "The old Baker farm lies empty, but the air above it feels heavy. No birds sing there." By the spring of 1890, the Baker case had grown cold, yet it lingered in conversation like a half-remembered nightmare. The town of Hayes had returned to its routines, rail shipments, cattle drives, and church fairs. But whenever a traveler went missing in western Kansas, people still whispered the same name. The Bakers had become a kind of legend, invoked to scare children or caution drifters about the dangers of trusting lonely houses on the prairie. It was during this uneasy calm that a new clue emerged. A telegraph operator in Wichita received a message addressed to E. Baker, care of Red Rock Station. The telegram, never claimed, was later copied into the station's logbook. It read simply, "Found new place, same work, send mother." Authorities traced the message to a small telegraph stop in Indian Territory, what is now northern Oklahoma. The handwriting on the form, according to an inspector, bore notable resemblance to the hand from the Hayes ledger. Sheriff Leland, though aging and near retirement, volunteered to travel south. His surviving notes record a bleak journey, endless miles of plains, sparse settlements, and the occasional way station where the name Baker drew suspicious looks. In late June, he reached Red Rock, then a small trading post surrounded by scrubland and railroad workers' tents. The station master recalled a family passing through months earlier, a woman in black and 2 young men, one carrying a tool chest. They had rented a wagon and headed west. Following that lead, Leland arrived at a newly established settlement known as Cedar Bluff Crossing. There he found a rough wooden sign advertising meals, milk, and lodging. Baker family, proprietors. The building behind it was small, recently constructed, with fresh whitewash and a crude stable out back. He entered the place at noon, posing as a traveler. The woman behind the counter introduced him, said herself as Mrs. Miller. Her sons, she said, were out tending stock. Yet her manner, her fixed gaze, and even the shape of her hands reminded Leland too closely of the daguerreotype recovered months before. He ordered coffee and observed the room carefully. The same checkered cloths, the same oil lamp design, and a faint discoloration on the floorboards where something had once been scrubbed. Leland excused himself and returned that evening with 2 deputies. When they entered, the building was deserted. Only the wind moved through the open shutters. In a back room they found a trapdoor leading to a shallow crawl space. Within it were empty jars, a rusted saw, and a pile of discarded boots, each mismatched, caked in dried mud. The next day, word spread again through Kansas papers. "The Bakers may live," declared one headline. Another read, "Cedar Bluff Shadows. The family returns." But as before, by the time a full posse was organized, the Bakers were gone. A wagon trail led south for 10 miles and vanished into the Cimarron sand. A witness later claimed to have seen a woman in mourning clothes boarding a freight train bound for Fort Worth, accompanied by 2 men. No tickets were sold under the name Baker or Miller. The station clerk remembered them only because the older woman asked if there would be meat on the journey. When the marshal's report reached Topeka months later, it mentioned the similarity between the Bakers and the infamous Bloody Benders yet again. "Some ghosts," the report read, "change their names, but not their habits." The old homestead near Hayes was left to rot. By winter, its roof had collapsed under snow, and prairie grass crept through the cracks. Still, riders who passed at dusk swore they could see a figure at the porch, thin, unmoving, as though waiting for company long overdue. When the Kansas winds quieted that following spring, the Baker story seemed to fade once more into rumor. Newspapers had turned their attention to railroad accidents and the fever outbreaks sweeping the western territories. Yet in the dusty archives of Ellis County, Sheriff Leland continued his private file, now nearly 2 inches thick, marked in pencil, "The Homestead Case." He kept it beneath his desk, long after most men would have closed it for good. Among his final entries, dated August 1890, lies a single report from a cattle trader named Isaac Pruitt. Pruitt claimed to have spent a night at a roadside house near the Oklahoma border. He described the host as a gray-haired woman and 2 quiet men, who provided supper and lodging for 50 cents. His description matched the Bakers exactly. And so did his fate. Pruitt's wagon was found 2 weeks later beside a creek near Kingfisher. His horse was gone, his belongings scattered. Only his boots remained, half buried in the mud. Locals who found the scene said there were no tracks except his own leading in, and none leading out. The report caught the attention of a federal marshal based in Guthrie, who coordinated with Kansas authorities to reopen the investigation. This time, Leland sent copies of his old notes, the ledger, the photograph, the cellar drawings, to the marshal's office. Reading through them, one deputy remarked that the similarities to the Bloody Benders were almost too close to be coincidence. The Benders, according to surviving accounts, had also vanished without a trace, leaving only graves and unanswered questions. When agents rode to the suspected house near Kingfisher, they found it burned to its foundation. Charred remains of furniture and iron tools lay scattered in the ashes, but no bodies. A single object survived mostly intact, a large cooking pot, blackened by fire, containing a partially melted brass locket. Inside, the initials MB were faintly engraved. The marshal noted the locket in his report, but omitted its inscription from public record, likely to prevent sensational speculation. Still, word leaked quickly. "The widow returns," read one Wichita headline. "Is this the end of the Bakers?" asked another. The public fascination grew so intense that travelers began making detours through the region, hoping to glimpse the burned remains. Many left small offerings, coins, flowers, even Bible pages, at the edge of the ruin, as though paying respects to victims whose names were never known. By the turn of 1891, Sheriff Leland's health was failing. He retired quietly to a small home in Salina, where he continued to receive letters from amateur sleuths and distant lawmen. One letter, preserved in his estate, came from a Kansas schoolteacher who had visited the old Baker site near Hayes. She described hearing faint metallic sounds beneath the soil, as if something hollow shifted when the wind blew. Leland never investigated further. When he died in 1893, his personal effects were auctioned by the county. The Baker file was nearly lost until a clerk, Thomas Ewell, rescued it from a stack of discarded papers. He later wrote that he kept it out of curiosity, though the contents made for uneasy reading. The ledger fragments were brittle, the photograph warped, and many pages were smudged by fingerprints no one could explain. That file now rests in the archives of the Kansas Historical Society. It is seldom requested, though researchers occasionally draw connections between it and the wider phenomenon of isolated homestead disappearances across the Great Plains during the late 19th century. Some speculate that the Bakers were part of a wandering criminal lineage, the spiritual descendants of the Bloody Benders. Others think they were simply one more desperate family swallowed by the hard, indifferent land. What remains certain is that the prairie remembers, and sometimes, when the wind shifts through the ruins near Hayes, locals, the Baker case might have ended there, sealed within dusty files and whispered tales, had it not been for a peculiar academic interest that emerged a decade later. In 1902, a professor of anthropology from Lawrence, Dr. Edwin Marner, began collecting frontier folklore across Kansas. His project, funded by the University of Kansas, focused on patterns of settlement violence and superstition among isolated communities. When he reached Ellis County, he heard the name Baker mentioned in nearly every household he visited. One elderly farmer told him, "It's best not to speak that name after dark. Some things live quiet, but never die." Intrigued, Dr. Marner traveled to the ruins of the Baker homestead himself. By then, little remained. The barn had collapsed completely, and the once flat prairie had swallowed much of the foundation. But in the northeast corner of what was once the kitchen, Marner's assistants found fragments of glass jars, rusted nails, and a portion of a stove door etched faintly with initials, E.B. Marner documented everything meticulously. His field notes, still preserved at the university, describe an unnatural stillness at the site, and the unsettling impression that the soil itself resists disturbance. He also recorded several local stories: a ranch hand who claimed to see lamplight flicker in the ruins, a child who swore she heard digging beneath the ground on windless nights, and an itinerant preacher who described finding animal bones arranged in human shape near the orchard. But Marner was no sensationalist. In his formal paper presented at the Kansas Historical Conference in 1903, he framed the Bakers as a sociological case study, evidence of how isolation, economic failure, and inherited trauma could warp frontier families into predators. He drew parallels between the Bakers and the Bloody Benders, whose case he cited as a precedent in depravity. Marner's measured tone lent the story an academic gravity, and for a brief time, the Baker hypothesis, as it was called, gained attention in psychological and criminological circles. Yet Marner himself seemed haunted by what he found. In a private letter to his colleague, discovered only after his death, he wrote, "I am increasingly persuaded that something more than madness operated in that family." The cellar beneath that house was not merely a crime scene. It felt like a shrine, built to something unseen, something that required tribute. Shortly after publishing his paper, Marner abandoned his research and left Kansas altogether, accepting a position in Maine. He never returned to the plains. In the years that followed, other researchers tried to trace the Bakers' lineage through census and church records. None succeeded. The names Elias and Samuel Baker appeared sporadically in land claims across Oklahoma, Colorado, and Missouri, but with no clear connection. One report from 1907 mentioned a Mrs. M. Barker operating a small boarding house outside Pueblo, Colorado, matching Martha Baker's age. Locals said she kept to herself and closed her inn at sunset, allowing no visitors afterward. When authorities later sought her for questioning, the house was found vacant, the hearth still warm. By the 1910s, the Baker story had become folklore, a cautionary tale told around campfires. Old-timers warned young travelers not to accept food from strangers on the road, invoking the baker's stew as a macabre symbol of misplaced trust. Some even claimed that the Baker curse lingered over that stretch of land, where livestock grew sick and travelers lost their way. But every legend hides a seed of truth. And deep within the archive, one final note from Sheriff Leland's old file remains unmatched to any known event. Scrawled in his own hand, perhaps. Near the end of his life, it reads simply, she said, "The ground remembers. By 1912, the land where the Baker homestead once stood had been resurveyed and sold to a cattle cooperative out of Hayes. They built a modest ranch house on the property and grazed herds across the same ground that once carried whispers of murder. For a few years, life there seemed normal, until the strangeness began again. It started with the livestock. Ranch hands found cattle refusing to drink from the northern well, their behavior frantic whenever driven near the old orchard line. 2 calves were discovered dead, their bodies arranged unnaturally, as though someone had lifted and placed them there with care. The foreman, a man named Joseph Hart, recorded these incidents in his work journal, noting that the ground near the old house feels hollow in places, like there's air beneath. When word spread, locals shrugged it off as prairie superstition. But that winter, during a routine well inspection, workers uncovered something embedded in the mud at the base of the dried cistern, a rusted metal hinge and a section of wood painted faintly white. Beneath it, a small cavity revealed blackened remains of what appeared to be fabric and bone. The county coroner, Dr. Myers, examined the find and wrote a brief but chilling statement. Fragments of textile and human tissue consistent with long burial, cause indeterminate, estimated age over 20 years. For many, that date range pointed directly to the Bakers. Newspapers revived the story briefly under headlines like "Old Crimes Stir Again in Hays County." Reporters compared the renewed findings to the still infamous Bloody Benders of Cherry Vale, noting that both families operated on the illusion of hospitality while masking a graveyard beneath their floors. Once again, history blurred into myth. Rancher Hart eventually abandoned the site in 1914 after a series of fires destroyed the barn and nearly claimed the new H. Insurance reports listed electrical cause unknown, though the ranch had no installed wiring at the time. When Hart sold the property, he left behind a note pinned to the door. "This land won't keep peace. Leave it be." Afterward, the property passed through several owners, none staying more than a few seasons. By 1920, it was officially listed as unoccupied agricultural land. Travelers passing along the rail spur nearby often remarked on the odd landscape, the soil dark and uneven, the grass sparse even in wet years. One conductor wrote in a letter to his wife, "You can always tell when you're near the Bakerland. The light changes, the birds go quiet." In 1926, a county surveyor performing elevation mapping rediscovered part of the Baker cellar. He described it in his log as a shallow depression supported by timber caved in long ago. Within that depression lay an iron pot, half buried, filled with small bones. He assumed them to be animal remains, but noted that the jaw structure appeared unusual. The fragments were never tested. Even into the 1930s, the story persisted in folklore collections. WPA writers documenting Kansas ghost tales frequently mentioned the house that fed the dead near Hays. One entry recorded a chilling local proverb: "If you smell stew on the wind past sundown, ride faster, because the bakers are cooking again." Folklore or not, people avoided the site well into the century. The grass reclaimed it, and only faint mounds in the earth betrayed where the foundations had once lain, yet some who visited claimed to hear the creak of wood underfoot, as if invisible boards still framed the house that no longer stood. It seemed the Bakers had faded into legend, until one final record, dated 1938, reignited the story once again. In the autumn of 1938, a highway crew expanding Route 40 west of Hays unearthed a discovery that startled even the most skeptical workers. Beneath a shallow embankment roughly half a mile from where the old Baker homestead once stood, a bulldozer struck what appeared to be a buried wooden beam. When the men pried it loose, the earth beneath collapsed into a small chamber, no larger than a root cellar, but clearly man-made. Inside, the foreman reported a foul odor and a sense of heat, though the soil was cold. The crew halted their work and called in the county sheriff, who in turn summoned a coroner and historian from the state university. The find drew quiet attention. Officials wanted no public panic, remembering how the earlier Baker legends had turned into circus-like fascination. When they descended into the cavity, they discovered remnants of a rotted table, 2 rusted hooks, and against the far wall, a decayed wooden crate. Inside that crate were bones, partial skeletons of 2 adults and what appeared to be 1 child. The coroner, Dr. Adrian Goff, recorded that the remains were highly desiccated, consistent with burial exceeding 40 years. He also noted evidence of blunt trauma to one skull and post-mortem charring on the others. Among the debris lay fragments of glass and a small piece of burned parchment bearing the faint inscription, "Guest." The handwriting was compared to samples from the Baker ledger still archived in Topeka, and though age made certainty impossible, experts declared the script identical in style and curvature. The press was notified only after the remains were removed. The Hayes Daily News published a subdued article titled, "Old Cellar Unearthed on Route Work, Human Bones Found." The report mentioned no names, but locals didn't need them. Within days, talk spread through coffee shops, schools, and church steps that the Bakers had surfaced again. The Kansas Historical Society dispatched a young archivist named Paul Henders to examine the find. Henders was a careful man, skeptical of legends, but his report reflected a quiet unease. He wrote, "The workmanship of the cellar indicates intent, not random storage, but a deliberate enclosure. The bones suggest repeated use of the same space over time. I am not convinced the family was gone as early as believed." Henders spent several months cross-referencing property records, tracing every sale of the Baker land since 1890. To his surprise, each transaction involved a name suspiciously similar to the last: Barker, Beck, even Booker, all signed by parties who vanished within years of the purchase. He noted this pattern in his 1939 memorandum, concluding, "Ownership of this land follows a recurring sequence of disappearance." When Henders attempted to publish his findings, his manuscript was rejected by the Kansas Historical Review as unfounded folklore. Shortly afterward, he left the state abruptly and took a position in Illinois. His original draft, found decades later, contained one chilling line crossed out in pencil: "I believe the Bakers never left Kansas. They changed names, moved in circles, and returned when memory thinned." Whether coincidence or curse, that discovery cemented the Baker case as one of Kansas's oldest unsolved mysteries. The parallels to the Bloody Benders were once again raised in academic discussions, especially the shared pattern of hospitality masking horror. One historian called it a recurring sickness of the frontier, where civilization meets hunger. By winter, the Route 40 crew finished their expansion, sealing the pit with fresh concrete. No marker was placed. Drivers now passed daily over ground that once concealed those remains, unaware of what history still lingered beneath their wheels. But for the plea of Hayes, the whispers began anew. Children dared each other to visit the roadside at dusk, claiming to hear a woman's voice humming under the wind. Ranchers swore they saw a dim lantern glow across. The Baker story entered the 1940s as an uncomfortable blend of history and superstition. By then, Hayes had modernized. Paved streets and electric lamps replaced the dim gaslight of the old frontier town. Yet the locals still avoided that stretch of Route 40 after dark. Drivers said their headlights flickered there, and some claimed to see shapes in the dust along the shoulder, shapes that vanished as soon as they slowed their cars. In 1942, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation briefly reopened the Baker file. Wartime shortages had brought new construction crews to the area, and one surveyor, while mapping drainage lines near the orchard remains, discovered a buried horseshoe stamped with initials, SB. When cleaned, the metal revealed traces of red enamel, rare for the period, and matching decorative ironwork once catalogued from the original Baker site. The KBI traced the object but found no provenance beyond recovered artifact, 1870s manufacture. The case was closed within months. Still, private researchers remained obsessed. Among them was Dr. Harriet Voss, a folklorist from Chicago who had studied the Bloody Benders extensively. She traveled to Kansas in 1944 to document what she called the persistence of inherited fear in rural narratives. Her notes, preserved at the University of Chicago archives, contain measured but haunting descriptions. The Baker story operates as a living myth. People speak of it not as past, but as current. The cellar, the ledger, the stew. These are not simply relics, but warnings. Voss interviewed more than 30 locals, including an aging ranch hand named Eddie Laird, who had worked the Route 40 property as a boy. Laird told her, "Sometimes you can smell smoke there, but it's not wood. It's like fat on a fire. Then the air goes dead. Voss asked if he'd ever seen anyone near the ruins. He replied, "Just once, a woman in black walkies." "And the fence line, same place the orchard used to be. Thought she was a mourner till I saw she left no tracks." Though Voss considered herself rational, her final field letter reveals unease. She wrote to a colleague in April 1945, "I am convinced this is less a ghost story and more an echo, trauma embedded in the landscape. The Bakers may be gone, but something in that soil remembers them, just as people recall pain long after healing." Her paper, Echoes on the Prairie, was published posthumously after she died unexpectedly in 1946 from pneumonia. It remains one of the few academic works to treat the Bakers as a cultural phenomenon rather than mere killers. During that same decade, Hayes underwent further development, and the Baker site was finally fenced off as private property owned by the county. Workers, leveling part of the field, reported their equipment stalling for no clear reason. Motors cutting out, horses refusing to pull. They left the area largely untouched. By the 1950s, the tale had become campfire canon. Parents warned travelers, "Don't take supper where the Bakers fed." Teenagers dared each other to visit the ghost road, and stories multiplied, each retelling stranger than the last. Some said the Baker's stew pot had been found intact beneath the soil, still warm. Others swore the family moved east under new names, taking their trade with them. The historian Paul Henders, now elderly, revisited Kansas in 1957 to give a lecture on frontier disappearances. When asked whether he believed the Bakers ever truly left the state, he paused and smiled faintly before answering. "The land here keeps what it's given, and Kansas has a long memory." He never elaborated, but that line became famous in local lore, printed on postcards and retold in documentaries decades later. By the dawn of the 1960s, few living residents remembered the Bakers firsthand. Yet the fields where their homestead once stood remained barren, despite every attempt to farm them. Even grass refused to take root near the old orchard trench. Farmers joked that the ground still eats. In 1961, a team from the Kansas Geological Survey visited the Hayes region to conduct soil density tests for a proposed rest stop along Route 40. Their report, rarely cited outside technical circles, contains one unexpected passage. Field technician Robert Keene, great-grandson of the 19th century coroner Dr. Horace Keene, noted anomalous subsurface voids near the former Baker property. The readings showed uneven density pockets exactly where old maps placed the farmhouse foundations. Keene and his crew excavated a few feet to verify their instruments. Beneath a layer of compacted silt, they uncovered wood fragments, corroded nails, and, most disturbingly, a patch of compact soil streaked with what looked like ash and bone dust. When the sample was sent for lab analysis, it revealed trace calcium consistent with human remains. The technicians, unfamiliar with the legend, treated it as contamination. But when locals heard of the find, they connected it instantly. Within weeks, the story resurfaced in local papers under headlines like "The Baker's Ground Disturbed Again." Older residents recalled Dr. Keene's ancestor, the original coroner, and called it proof that blood calls blood. The younger Keene refused interviews, but wrote privately in his field journal. "The men say the ground hums when the drill hits certain spots. I don't know what that means. I only know I can't sleep." Construction on the rest stop was quietly moved 2 miles east. The official reason, unstable subsoil. The Baker myth now belonged to a new generation. Throughout the 1960s, amateur investigators, partly inspired by rising interest in true crime, began revisiting old frontier murders. A local historian, Margaret Rowe, compiled what she called the Plains Butcher Files, linking dozens of unsolved disappearances from 1870 to 1900. The Bakers featured prominently, described as a bridge between recorded atrocity and vanishing evidence. Rowe compared them once more to the Bloody Benders, writing, "The Bakers were not unique, but they were meticulous. They built their crimes into the land itself, ensuring time would erase the difference between earth and grave." In 1967, Rowe presented her research at a historical symposium in Topeka. During the Q&A, she was asked if she believed the Bakers ever faced justice. She answered simply, "No one catches ghosts." That same year, a small fire swept through the Ellis County Records Office, destroying several boxes of 19th-century documents, including the original Baker file saved decades earlier by clerk Thomas Ewell. Though duplicates existed elsewhere, key materials were lost: the ledger fragments, the daguerreotype photograph, and the coroner's early sketches of the cellar. The timing of the blaze, occurring on the anniversary week of the 1888 investigation, did not go unnoticed. Superstition flared again. Locals began leaving small lanterns at the Route 40 fence post each October, a gesture meant to light the road for the lost. It became an unofficial tradition, still practiced by some families today. By 1969, new developers attempted to purchase the Baker land for a grain depot. Soil testing again revealed instability and organic anomalies. The sale collapsed. The land reverted to county ownership, where it sat idle under the designation non-arable terrain. At that point, nearly 80 years had passed since the Bakers' disappearance. Yet every attempt to erase their presence, by building, farming, or forgetting, seemed to fail. The name lingered like dust that refused to settle. A journalist from the Topeka Journal, covering the abandoned property that same year, described the site at twilight. "The air goes still here, the grass moves without wind, and somewhere beneath this ground, history breathes V's, rise softly, waiting to be remembered." By the early 1970s, Kansas was changing. Interstates carved across old cattle trails, motels replaced stage stops, and the modern traveler moved too quickly to notice the empty fields that once held stories. But the Baker land endured, untouched, a sliver of prairie fenced off from progress. In 1972, a documentary filmmaker named Neil Carrington arrived in Hays after reading an old article titled "The Ghosts of Route 40." Carrington specialized in obscure American folklore, and he intended to make a short feature for public television exploring the overlap between myth and rural history. His team included a sound engineer, a camera operator, and one historical consultant from the university. They began filming interviews with local residents, elderly farmers, a retired sheriff, a handful of teenagers who used the site as a dare. Most recounted familiar stories: the stew, the missing travelers, the cellar. Yet one interview stood out. It came from Mrs. Clara Voss, niece of the late folklorist Dr. Harriet Voss. Clara still possessed her aunt's notes and field recordings, which had never been published in full. Among them were descriptions of resonant tones captured on phonograph cylinders near the Baker ruins. Clara played one for Carrington, a faint, rhythmic knocking beneath the hiss of static, like someone tapping on hollow wood. Carrington's team set up microphones at the site over 3 consecutive nights. On the second night, the sound engineer recorded low-frequency vibrations not explained by wind or machinery. He described them as a pulse under the ground. The following morning, the crew found one of their tripods toppled, though there had been no storm. When the footage aired in 1973 under the title "The Baker's Silence," it became an unexpected sensation. Viewers across Kansas sent letters claiming similar experiences: strange noises, flickering lights, gates, even dreams about the Baker's house, though they'd never seen it. The program drew comparisons to paranormal broadcasts, but remained careful to present everything as historical investigation. Carrington closed the documentary with a simple line: "Some histories refuse burial. They wait for someone to listen." The broadcast revived scholarly interest in the case. The Kansas Historical Society issued a brief statement reaffirming the Bakers' authenticity as documented historical figures, citing tax records and the 1888 investigations. In the same breath, they dismissed any supernatural implications, calling the haunting an expression of cultural memory rooted in trauma. Still, the public fascination grew. Travelers began visiting the site again, leaving notes or trinkets by the fence. Local shops sold Baker stew novelty cans and postcards depicting a ghostly farmhouse under a full moon. But as often happens, amusement gave way to unease. In 1975, a pair of college students camping near the orchard vanished overnight. Their tent remained intact, belongings undisturbed, but no footprints led away. Search teams scoured the prairie for days without result. The official explanation blamed a runaway attempt or animal attack. Unofficially, the sheriff at the time told reporters, "It feels like the land swallowed them." That summer, a memorial cross appeared near the orchard fence line. No one claimed responsibility. The inscription read, "For those who stopped here, and for those who never left." Carrington returned to film a follow-up special, but found the county had sealed access, citing safety concerns due to soil erosion. His second documentary was never finished. Years later, when he spoke about the project, he said quietly, "We didn't tell half of what we heard." The Baker legend entered American folklore anthologies soon after, filed beside the Bloody Bee, enders as frontier familiars, families who turned against travelers in the lawless expanse of the plains. But to Kansas locals, it remained simpler, heavier, and more real, a wound under the wheat. The 1980s brought a new kind of curiosity to the Baker story, one shaped not by superstition but by investigation. The rise of forensic science and cold case television gave armchair detectives reason to revisit forgotten crimes, and the Bakers, long buried in folklore, found new life on late-night programs and paperback covers. In 1983, the Midwestern Chronicle ran a serialized feature titled The Bakers of Kansas, Fact or Frontier Fiction. The journalist, Ruth Ellen Dawes, retraced Sheriff Leland's original investigation using surviving records. She located two descendants of the Bakers' supposed neighbors, the McFaddens, who provided family letters describing the quiet woman in black and her two silent sons. Dawes noted the uncanny resemblance between those accounts and the official affidavits from 1888, many long considered apocryphal. Dawes also obtained a copy of the 1903 lecture notes from Professor Edwin Marner, the academic who had earlier analyzed the case sociologically. In her article, she quoted one line that caught national attention. The Bakers were not aberrations of evil, but reflections of hunger, isolation, and opportunity gone feral. Her writing was restrained but compelling, painting the Bakers as tragic products of the frontier rather than monsters. Still, readers gravitated to the darker details. Subscriptions surged, and the Chronicle devoted an entire issue to unsolved crimes of the prairie. Letters poured in from across the country, descendants of travelers claiming possible ancestors among the Bakers' victims, and skeptics insisting the whole tale was a moral fable. That same year, Dawes convinced county officials to let her tour the fenced-off Baker property. Accompanied by a sheriff's deputy and a cameraman, she documented her findings in detail. The footage, later archived at the local historical museum, shows a flat, desolate face, all broken by one surviving stone foundation. In the video, Dawes can be heard saying, "It's colder here than the air around it." Her breath clouds visibly, though the others do not. Within minutes, the camera captures a faint rumble, like distant thunder, though the sky is clear. Dawes pauses, listens, and mutters, "That's under us." The deputy, clearly uneasy, insists they leave. The tape ends abruptly. In her published piece, Dawes dismissed the noises as shifting subsoil, but she admitted privately in an interview years later, "I felt something alive in that ground, not spiritual, just waiting." The renewed attention led to new forensic interest. In 1986, a small team of archaeologists conducted a non-invasive survey using ground-penetrating radar. Their findings, though inconclusive, showed multiple anomalies beneath the surface, cavities, voids, and linear disturbances consistent with previous excavation or burial activity. The report was archived quietly without follow-up. Public fascination peaked in 1988, the centennial year of the original case. Newspapers ran retrospectives comparing the Bakers to the Bloody Benders once again, noting how both families represented the twin shadows of the Kansas frontier. The State Museum displayed a reconstructed model of the Baker homestead based on surviving sketches. Visitors reported that the exhibit gave off a chill even in summer. That October, a memorial symposium in Hayes gathered historians, folklorists, and criminologists to discuss the enduring legacy of the Bakers. Among the speakers was an elderly man, none other than filmmaker Neil Carrington, who closed the session with a quiet statement. Every decade thinks it has buried them, and every decade they rise again. Maybe that's the punishment. For us, not for them. His words lingered over the silent audience. When he returned to his hotel that evening, Harrington asked for a room facing west toward the plains. He told the receptionist he wanted to see where the sun goes down on the Baker's land. The next morning, his curtains were open, and his CT, Carrington's disappearance in 1988, reopened the Baker story yet again. This time not as folklore, but as breaking news. The Hayes Daily News headline the next morning read, "Documentary filmmaker missing after Baker symposium." Police searched his hotel, the surrounding roads, and the nearby fields, but found no sign of him. His rental car remained parked outside, keys still in the ignition. On the desk inside his room, officers found his open notebook. The final page contained only a single sentence, written in his distinct hand. "I found the cellar." The phrase was later photographed and archived, though the hotel staff denied any knowledge of his whereabouts. His luggage contained several cassette tapes labeled Oral Histories, Baker Site. Yet 2 were blank. Within days, theories multiplied. Some said Carrington had staged his disappearance for publicity. Others insisted he'd gone to the Baker property alone that night. Locals near Route 40 reported seeing headlights around midnight near the old fence line, but no vehicle was recovered. A month later, a hiker discovered Carrington's camera case half buried in silt near the Smoky Hill River. Inside were undeveloped rolls of film, most water-damaged beyond recovery. One image, however, survived partially, a blurred photograph showing a small, square opening in the earth, light catching on what appeared to be rusted hooks. The negative was analyzed by experts, who confirmed it was taken somewhere on the Baker tract, though the location no longer matched modern topography. Carrington's family eventually held a memorial service, though his body was never found. The story drew national attention once again, cementing the Bakers as not merely a 19th-century legend, but an enduring 20th-century mystery. In 1989, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation reopened the case as a historical disappearance. Their report, Never, released in full, mentions renewed excavations at the old Homestead site. Teams found remnants of iron tools, animal bones, and what one investigator described as residual heat readings beneath the soil despite near-freezing temperatures. The devices, new for their time, baffled operators who insisted their instruments weren't malfunctioning. The KBI eventually sealed its findings under archival restriction. An internal memo, leaked years later, carried the handwritten margin note, "Ground too soft, like it's been turned recently." To the public, Carrington became the final victim of the Baker curse. Television specials re-aired his old documentary, framing it as prophetic. One episode concluded with the line, "He went looking for echoes, and the echoes took him." Historians pushed back, emphasizing the need for rational interpretation. They cited the Bloody Benders again, arguing that frontier violence bred myth faster than memory. Yet even skeptics admitted the coincidences were difficult to ignore. Carrington's last confirmed words, "I found the cellar," linked chillingly to the physical discoveries across the decades. The root worker's pit in 1938, the bones beneath the cistern, the structural voids detected in 1961 and 1986. By the early 1990s, renewed urban development threatened to erase the Baker land entirely. Plans were made to expand Route 40 into a 4-lane highway. But during preliminary grading in 1992, heavy machinery inexplicably malfunctioned on the section nearest the old orchard. Hydraulic systems failed, and the ground reportedly sank several inches overnight. Work was rerouted yet again. Locals took it as a sign. Some said the Bakers wouldn't allow the earth to be disturbed. Others believed Carrington's disappearance had stirred something that preferred to stay buried. The land was eventually classified as historically sensitive and left untouched. Grass grew over the trenches once more. By century's end, few travelers knew what lay beneath that quiet patch of Kansas earth. But those who did rarely spoke of it after dark. Through the 1990s, the Baker homestead became a quiet obsession for historians, investigators, and the occasional thrill-seeker. The land itself, though legally restricted, drew nighttime visitors who sought proof of something more than legend. Some came with cameras, others with shovels, all hoping to find what Carrington had written of, the cellar. In 1995, a regional magazine titled Frontier Echoes ran a feature on unresolved hauntings of the plains. The Bakers received their own section, connecting their story directly to the infamous Bloody Benders. The author noted that both families operated during times of intense isolation, that both provided comfort and food to strangers, and that both vanished without burial or trial. Perhaps, the article speculated, that is why their ghosts cannot rest, because history never sentenced them. Around the same year, a graduate student from the University of Kansas, Daniel Reeve, decided to make the Baker story the subject of his anthropology thesis. His angle was rational. He wanted to trace how folklore evolves from trauma. He began by interviewing the descendants of early Ellis County settlers. Many of them, though far removed from the events, still spoke of the Bakers with an uncanny consistency: the stew, the cellar, the black dress, the strange hum of the soil. Reeves' thesis draft, later preserved in the university archives, contains a passage that few who read it forget. I visited the land on a still evening in late September. The air smelled of rain, though the sky was clear. When I stepped beyond the fence line, the sound underfoot changed. It was as if I was walking on something hollow. I knelt, placed my palm on the earth, and felt warmth, faint but steady. The ground was breathing. Reeves submitted his work the following year and received top marks for narrative insight. Yet after graduation, he withdrew from academic life entirely, moving east and refusing interviews about the project. His advisor, Dr. Tilda Moran, later commented, "Daniel became quiet afterward, obsessed with whether folklore could infect memory itself." By the late 1990s, the story had become a small industry. Independent filmmakers, authors, and amateur ghost hunters descended on Hayes, producing documentaries and speculative novels. Most were dismissed as fiction, but one detail reappeared across testimonies: a subtle, rhythmic noise beneath the soil, described alternately as tapping, breathing, or the faint stir of wind underground. In 1998, the county sheriff's office received an anonymous call reporting figures with lanterns near the old orchard. Deputies found nothing but footprints leading halfway into the field, then stopping abruptly. Soil impressions indicated 3 people, 1 tall, 2 shorter. The following morning, faint scorch marks appeared in the same area, forming a half circle around the old foundation. Laboratory testing confirmed heat exposure, but no trace of accelerants. That incident revived the legend once more. The Topeka Journal ran a feature under the headline, "The Bakers Still Host at Night." Public curiosity surged again, drawing both tourists and skeptics. The local Chamber of Commerce even considered a historical marker, but abandoned the idea after residents protested. One elderly farmer was quoted as saying, "Marking that ground invites them back." The debate over how to remember the Bakers grew louder than the facts themselves. Were they killers, ghosts, or just symbols of frontier cruelty? Academics continue to cite the Bloody Benders as the factual parallel, but locals clung to the Bakers as their own dark inheritance, a story that belonged to their soil. As the century closed, the land near the old orchard stood unchanged, a low fence, pale grass, and an emptiness that deepened at dusk. Yet every few months someone new came looking, historians, filmmakers, or wanderers drawn by a name whispered for over 100 years. And the ground, they said, was Allah. By the early 2000s, the Baker homestead had drifted into the realm of online legend. Message boards and early websites traded stories, maps, and grainy photos, claiming to show the cellar entrance or ghost lights near Route 40. One popular forum thread, titled "The Bakers Never Left," featured hundreds of posts, ranging from earnest research to hoaxes. A few contributors, however, appeared knowledgeable, citing details that never made it into public record. Among them was a user calling themselves Elias Returns, who claimed to possess letters written by Martha Baker herself. The posts described hidden rooms of hospitality beneath the house where guests rested in darkness. The language mimicked 19th century phrasing too precisely to be dismissed outright. When other users pressed for proof, Elias Returns promised to release photographs but vanished from the forum before posting again. Traces of the account disappeared entirely by 2003. That same year, a pair of amateur historians, Gina and Mark Holloway, visited the Baker site to record a podcast episode about Kansas' forgotten crimes. They arrived at dusk, setting up a portable recorder near the Orchard Trench. Their last transmission, preserved on tape, lasts 7 minutes. It begins with normal dialogue and ambient wind, followed by a faint, rhythmic knocking. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again. Then, Gina can be heard whispering, "Mark, someone's walking." A few seconds later, a metallic creak echoes, and the recording ends. Search teams found their vehicle still parked by the fence line, doors locked, keys inside. The recorder lay half buried in the grass 10 yards from the car. The Holloways were never found. The event drew national coverage, and for a brief time, the Bakers returned to headlines once more. Television crews descended on Hayes. Reporters interviewed terrified locals and state officials. Renewed access restrictions to the property. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation reopened the area under controlled excavation in 2004. Using modern ground-penetrating radar, they confirmed multiple subterranean cavities, one of them large enough to be a chamber. Excavation began, but after 2 days, the dig abruptly ceased. The official report cited structural collapse and risk to personnel, but internal correspondence obtained years later revealed something stranger. In a memo to the state director, one field agent wrote, "We heard movement from within the lower cavity, like shifting debris or faint breathing. No one was inside when we checked, but the sound continued for almost 3 minutes. All instruments showed heat variance of +8 degrees localized to the cavity floor." The site was sealed permanently under concrete and reclassified as protected landform. The records were locked under state confidentiality laws. Meanwhile, paranormal investigators seized upon the Holloway disappearance. National networks aired specials comparing it once again to the Bloody Benders, whose crimes had occurred a century earlier. Experts pointed out that both families operated within the same corridor of Kansas trails. Both offered food and shelter, and both seemed to vanish into myth the moment exposure loomed. One historian, Dr. Benjamin Rourke, appearing in a televised interview, summarized the connection succinctly. The Bakers were the echo that history tried to forget. They were the reminder that civilization grows over graves. As years passed, the Holloway case faded from public attention, joining the long list of disappearances tied to the land. Local folklore grew darker. Residents began avoiding Route 40 at night. Truckers swore their radios cut out near the old turnoff, replaced by faint static resembling a heartbeat. By 2008, the county had erected a tall steeple fence around the remaining acreage. No trespassing signs hung crookedly along the posts, though the locks often appeared disturbed, as if someone still entered from the inside. And on quiet nights, in 2010, a state development project proposed rerouting a new utility line through the old Baker property. Engineers reviewed the land surveys, unaware of its reputation, and filed for clearance. Within a week, protest letters flooded the county office, handwritten notes from local residents, historians, and even descendants of the earliest settlers. One letter, unsigned, read simply, "You cannot dig there. The ground already has what it needs." The project was delayed, but curiosity returned. A young documentarian from Wichita, Leah Danner, saw an opportunity to revisit the story with modern technology. Her film, Under the Orchard, The Baker's Legacy, was pitched as a balanced look at the myth versus the evidence. She interviewed archivists, folklorists, and surviving relatives of Sheriff Leland. In one scene, she examined the original coroner's notes written by Dr. Horace Keene, remarking on how his calm, clinical handwriting contrasted with the horror he described. Danner's tone throughout was skeptical. She dismissed the idea of hauntings and instead framed the Bakers as a study in forgotten justice. But during filming near the sealed pit, now overgrown with weeds and rusted fencing, something occurred that unsettled even her crew. While recording ambient sound at sunset, the team's digital audio meters registered faint pulses, regular, rhythmic, below human vocal range. They assumed it was machinery from the nearby highway until the engineer confirmed there was no frequency interference. Then, on playback, a low human voice whispered something unintelligible. Only one word was clear: stay. Danner included the sound in her final cut, but labeled it equipment anomaly. Still, the moment spread widely online, reigniting public interest. The documentary premiered in 2011 to critical acclaim for its restraint. Viewers described it as quietly horrifying, not because of ghosts, but because of what it implied about the persistence of memory. Danner ended the film with a voiceover that quoted from a letter found in the archives, believed to be written by Martha Baker herself. The road brings them. The night keeps them. The ground forgives nothing. That final line became the film's tagline, and a chilling addition to the folklore. In the years that followed, researchers re-examined the Bakers through new lenses: criminology, sociology, even psychology. A 2013 paper argued that the Bakers, like the Bloody Benders, represented a convergence of isolation and social breakdown. Families pushed past sanity by hunger and distance. Another essay called them ghosts of a system that demanded survival at any cost. Meanwhile, strange incidents continued. Hikers reported electronic devices failing near the site, compasses spinning, cameras freezing, phones dying abruptly. In 2015, a maintenance drone surveying power lines captured footage of faint circular impressions in the grass, perfectly aligned with the old foundation's outline, though no structure had existed for nearly a century. When analysts enhanced the image, they noticed a smaller circle within the main one, glowing faintly from residual heat. Scientists attributed it to buried metallic debris. Locals were not so sure. By 2018, the county quietly expanded the restricted area, citing environmental stabilization. No public notice was given, but residents observed new fencing and unmarked vehicles parked near the road for several nights. When questioned, officials said it was soil remediation. They offered no further detail. Around the same time, historian Dr. Rourke returned for an interview marking the 130th anniversary of the Bakers' disappearance. When asked whether he believed the family truly existed, he replied, "They existed. The question is, do they still?" These. A reporter pressed him to clarify, but he only smiled and said, "The earth doesn't forget." By 2020, the Baker story had become inseparable from the landscape itself, a kind of living rumor that the people of Hayes learned to coexist with. It was no longer just a legend told to frighten travelers. It had become history's ghost, breathing quietly beneath the surface of ordinary life. That year, an independent research group calling itself the Frontier Forensics Initiative announced a plan to digitally reconstruct lost Kansas case files using recovered archives. Among their earliest subjects was, inevitably, the Baker homestead. Using AI-based pattern reconstruction, the team pieced together fragments of Leland's burned notes, Dr. Keene's autopsy sketches, and portions of the missing ledger once thought destroyed in the 1967 fire. What emerged shocked even the most skeptical historians. Several partial ledger entries appeared to reference numbers rather than names, possibly coded dates. When cross-referenced with missing person reports from the 1880s and early 1890s, a disturbing pattern surfaced. Each entry matched a recorded disappearance, along the westward trade route, often within a week of its listed figure. One line read simply, 12 served. Another, last stew, snow coming. The researchers avoided speculation in their report, but a quiet conclusion hung between the data points. The Bakers might have been responsible for more deaths than any other frontier family on record, rivaling the Bloody Benders in scale. Local reaction was mixed. Some residents demanded a memorial for the unnamed victims. Others urged silence, fearing renewed curiosity would wake something that's learned to sleep. The county commissioner himself stated in a press interview, "We respect our history, but we don't dig up graves that deep anymore." Still, the project's findings reignited the legend online. Digital sleuths pored over the reconstructed ledger, finding faint symbol. Circles, crosses, arrows, drawn in margins. One symbol, resembling a spiral, appeared repeatedly beside the word guest. Forums debated whether it was a family mark, a tally, or something older. In December 2020, just weeks after the report went public, seismic sensors in the area recorded unexplained vibrations centered precisely beneath the old orchard site. The readings were faint but rhythmic, occurring at irregular intervals, too deliberate for wind or traffic. Technicians assumed faulty calibration until multiple sensors confirmed identical pulses, each lasting about 12 seconds. The story made brief headlines, dismissed as instrument error. But those living closest to the site told something different. A farmer named Reed Wallace claimed to have seen flickering lights beneath the soil that same night, like lanterns moving under glass. Another witness described hearing a woman's voice singing, soft and tuneless, carried by the winter wind. A week later, a small sinkhole appeared within the fenced perimeter, roughly where the old cellar had once been. The county filled it immediately with gravel and concrete, posting a sign that read simply, "No entry, unstable ground." But the word unstable seemed to capture more than geology. For residents of Hayes, the Bakers were no longer just a story from 1888. They were a reminder that history does not vanish when its buildings fall. It lingers, unseen, beneath foundations and highways, waiting to be heard again. In a final interview before his death in 2021, historian Dr. Benjamin Rourke summarized it best. The Bakers began as people. Then they became a story. Now they're geography. That's how legends survive. They stop needing us to tell them. As he spoke, the camera caught a faint tremor in the background, a subtle movement in the curtain behind him. Rourke didn't notice. The recording ended there. By 2023, the Baker homestead had become less a location than a phenomenon, a convergence of history, folklore, and unease. The field itself lay quiet under layers of restored prairie grass, its fencing rusted, its warnings faded by wind and time. Few residents of Hayes spoke of it openly anymore. The county considered removing the barriers altogether, but each motion stalled without explanation. Someone, it seemed, always objected, often anonymously. That summer, a local teacher named Elaine Parker began leading history students on walking tours of forgotten frontier sites. Against local advice, she planned one near the Baker Tract, framing it as an exercise in separating truth from myth. Her class arrived one evening near sundown. The air was unusually still, heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky remained clear. She pointed toward the fence and began reciting the facts. The Homestead Act, the sheriff's reports, the parallels to the Bloody Benders. Her students later recalled that midway through her talk, the ground seemed to hum faintly beneath their feet, a vibration more felt than heard. One student said he noticed movement beyond the grass line, shapes like figures where no one stood. Another claimed to see a small lantern glow between the weeds, drifting side to side before fading. Parker ended the lesson early and ushered the group back to their van. She never scheduled another tour. That incident, while unreported in official channels, joined the long list of quiet retellings that make up the Baker legend. Each decade adds its own verse: the sheriff's unease, the professor's theory, the filmmaker's disappearance, the hollow ground that breathes. The story no longer belongs to one generation or another. It's become part of Kansas itself, absorbed into its soil the way storms and droughts leave their mark. Even today, drivers along the western edge of Route 40 sometimes notice odd changes as they pass the old orchard site. The radio drops to static, the temperature dips. A faint smell, somewhere between smoke and stew, seeps through the vents before fading away. Most dismiss it as imagination. Others whisper that it's the bakers calling travelers to supper once more. The true number of their victims, if any still remain, will likely never be known. Records are gone, graves unmarked, names forgotten. But the questions endure. Who were they really? A family broken by isolation and hunger, or inheritors of something darker passed down from the Bender's cursed soil? Late each autumn, as Kansas fields burn in controlled harvest fires, the smoke drifts across haze and over the old Baker land. Locals say it carries a sound with it, a dull knocking, faint but deliberate, like someone stirring an iron pot beneath the earth. Whether it's wind, memory, or something older, no one can say. The Bakers have long since vanished from maps, but not from the air, nor from the quiet ground that still remembers their names. And when night settles over the plains and the prairie turns black under the weight of silence, the land holds its breath, waiting perhaps for the next traveler to stop, hungry and unknowing, at the edge of Kansas where the road forgets to end,